When the desert night finally gave way to the thin golden light of dawn, the Nile shimmered like a long, breathing vein through the body of Egypt. You would have woken early, not because of a clock or a rooster, but because of the rhythm of light itself. The Egyptians' day began when the horizon turned from blue, black to pale ochre, and the cool air still clung to the mud-brick walls of their small homes. If you were a farmer, your body already knew what to do. The first task was to rise, stretch stiff limbs from sleeping on woven mats, and offer a small word of thanks, perhaps to Ra, who had once again guided the sun from darkness. It was not a loud prayer, more a quiet acknowledgement that the great cycles of life, the river's flood, the crop's growth, the sun's return, continued as they always had. Breakfast, if you could call it that. There was bread, coarse and gritty from the sand, that found its way into the grindstones. Archaeologists have found that the teeth of Egyptians were worn down not by sugar, but by sand. The act of eating itself was a small act of endurance. Alongside bread there might be onions, or a few figs and, if you were lucky, beer. Not the kind you know. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and almost more of a liquid bread. It was sustenance as much as it was comfort, made from emmer wheat or barley. It was the drink of the living and, in a symbolic way, the drink of the dead. Beer and bread were the foundation of everything. In the tomb inscriptions of even low-ranking workers, 1,000 loaves and 1,000 jugs of beer were promised in the afterlife. It was a way of saying, may your days never be hungry, may your labor never go unrewarded. The hum of the village as the sun climbed, the sounds of life thickened. Grinding stones, voices calling across narrow lanes, the faint bleating of goats. Mud brick houses lined the dusty paths, their walls often patched and uneven. Roofs doubled as sleeping platforms on hot nights or storage for baskets and tools. Inside, there was little decoration, maybe a clay pot, a small shrine to a household god like Bez or Tauret, guardians of the home and childbirth. Women tended to the home and children, but also worked, weaving, grinding grain, fetching water from the river. The act of grinding itself was long and rhythmic, a movement that could take hours every day. Archaeologists have found the shallow, worn hollows in limestone slabs used for centuries by hands now long gone. Imagine the steady scrape of stone on stone, day after day, year after year, the sound of survival. The field and the flood. If you stepped beyond the village, the landscape widened, the lush green band along the river fading quickly into desert sand. The Nile's waters were everything. Life was measured not by seasons as we know them, but by the river's moods. Akat, the inundation, when the waters rose and the fields were swallowed. Peret, the growing season when the silt-rich soil was ploughed and planted. Shemu, the harvest when the grain was gathered and stored. This rhythm dictated every movement, every job, every meal. Farmers worked under the eye of local officials, scribes with reed pens and scrolls of papyrus, recording each field's yield, every portion of grain owed to the temple or the state. Bureaucracy in Egypt was ancient, meticulous, and endless. It was not enough to grow food, one had to account for it, to prove one's part in the machine that kept Egypt alive. A farmer might spend his morning inspecting the irrigation dikes, ensuring the water flowed evenly into his plot. Water rights were not casual matters. The Nile's gifts had to be divided carefully, and disputes were settled through a system that mixed religion and law so thoroughly that they were almost indistinguishable. The river, after all, belonged to the gods before it belonged to any man. The scribe's world. If you were not a farmer but a scribe, your morning would look different, yet no less routine. You would sit cross-legged in a shaded courtyard, your tools simple: a wooden pallet, 2 small cakes of pigment, black and red, a bundle of reeds trimmed to fine points, and rolls of papyrus. The work was exacting, copying accounts, drawing up land records, keeping track of temple offerings. The Egyptians prized writing, but not as art in itself. It was a form of order. To write was to preserve, to name, to define, a way of holding back chaos. Even the gods were said to write the fate of each person at birth. And so, the scribe's careful strokes were a sacred act in miniature. The black ink was for the ordinary. Contracts, letters, numbers. Red was for the exceptional. Names of gods, headings, or moments of danger. To be a scribe was to live apart from the fields, but still bound to them. The ink on your fingers might record the grain your neighbor's sweat produced. In this way, Egypt's great pyramid of labor held firm. From the farmer to the administrator to the pharaoh himself, each was sustained by the other. The hum of the temples as noon approached, the heat thickened, the work slowed. In the heart of the city or town, the temple loomed, not merely a place of worship but of bureaucracy, storage, and community. The temples of Egypt were not silent halls of prayer, they were living complexes where priests, scribes, and workers moved in quiet coordination. The temple owned land, collected taxes, distributed food, and oversaw festivals. Even in small villages, the local shrines served as a kind of administrative center. Offerings of grain, incense, or linen passed through its hands. Inside the temple walls, life was measured in rituals: the washing of statues, the renewal of sacred oils, the offering of food to the gods who never ate but always required feeding. The priests followed strict routines of purity, shaving their heads and bodies, washing several times a day, wearing fresh linen. These acts, however repetitive, were the mechanism by which the world was kept in balance. The Egyptians believed that if the rituals ceased, chaos, Isfet, would return. Afternoon heat. When the sun stood high, work paused. The Nile breeze carried the smell of wet mud and papyrus. Men sought shade under palm fronds, women cooled clay jars in the water to chill the beer. Children splashed near the banks, watched by anxious mothers. The river was both giver and taker. Crocodiles, once sacred to Sobek, the crocodile god, lurked in the deeper channels. In this quiet midday, Egypt felt timeless. People rested, the air hummed, the river flowed. Yet beneath this peace was constant labor, invisible, unending. In the workshops, artisans carved stone-shaped pottery, or painted wooden coffins with scenes of daily life. The same daily life their owners hoped to continue in eternity. In the granaries, workers recorded sacks of grain, sealing them with small clay impressions of the overseer's ring. Even rest was part of the cycle, for when the sun descended again, there was more to do. Evening and offerings, as the heat softened and the sky turned amber, the village stirred once more. Fires were lit, bread baked, and families gathered. Music, if any, came from simple instruments: the rattle of a sistrum, the hollow beat of a drum. Stories were told of gods and kings, of floods and harvests long past. Dinner was modest: more bread, maybe lentil stew, perhaps fish if the day had been good. The smoke from cooking fires rose over the flat roofs, blurring the horizon. People would sit in the fading light, watching the river gleam in the last of the sun, speaking little. The day had been long, and tomorrow would be the same. Before sleep, small lamps were lit in front of household shrines. Prayers were murmured for health, for good dreams, for protection from snakes and spirits. The night returned, and with it a quiet certainty that the same patterns would unfold again with dawn. The question of time to live in ancient Egypt was to live in the certainty of cycles, of sunrise and sunset, flood and harvest, life and death. But perhaps, as the last flicker of the oil lamp dimmed, someone might have wondered, would the river always rise as it had? Would the sun always return? It was a question no one could answer, and yet, every day they lived as though it would. The sun has already passed its peak, and the village settles into the steady rhythm of afternoon. The Nile glows bronze in the distance. If you lived in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, or perhaps the New Kingdom, you would feel the weight of something larger than yourself pressing quietly upon every corner of life, the unseen machinery of order. The Egyptians called it Ma'at, the divine balance of truth, justice, and harmony. It governed the flood of the river, the justice of the court, the fairness of trade, and even the way a loaf of bread should be baked. To live rightly meant to maintain Ma'at, just as the pharaoh himself was sworn to do. And so, every act of daily life, even the dullest, most repetitive task, was a small ritual that kept the cosmos from falling into chaos. The bureaucracy of eternity, it is difficult to imagine now, but Egypt's bureaucracy was one of the first great engines of civilization. It was not the monuments that kept Egypt alive for thousands of years. It was the paperwork, from the Nile Delta to the cataracts of Nubia. Every measure of grain, every shipment of stone, and every worker's wage was recorded in ink on papyrus. Thousands of fragments survive, not grand decrees of kings, but mundane list tools issued to a crew, jars of beer distributed at a work site, donkeys borrowed and returned. The scribes were the lifeblood of this machine. They were trained from childhood, often sons of other scribes, and their education was long and punishing. The satire of the trades, a text copied by countless apprentices, describes other professions in deliberately miserable detail: the potter covered in mud, the fisherman eaten by flies, the washerman stinking of the river. Only the scribe, it insisted, lived without hardship, though in truth, they too worked under the weight of endless repetition. Their pens recorded not only the living but also the dead. The census of tomb workers at Deir el-Medina, for instance, includes notations for absences: sick, burying his mother, bitten by a scorpion. It was meticulous, bureaucratic empathy. Every absence had a line, every person, a record. Temples as engines of life. When you think of temples, you might imagine solemn rituals or priests in white linen chanting to gods. Yet to an Egyptian, the temple was also an administrative hub, a farm, a factory, a treasury, and a granary. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, for example, owned vast tracts of land across the country. It employed thousands of workers, farmers, carpenters, gardeners, brewers, bakers, and scribes. The priests managed these estates like accountants. The temple's god was not simply worshipped, he was fed daily, dressed, entertained, and symbolically paraded. Every loaf baked for the god's altar came from real fields. Every jar of beer brewed for his rituals came from grain taxed from real peasants. When those offerings were made, the surplus was redistributed. The temple fed its workers and supported the local economy. The system was circular, like the river's flood. Even small shrines operated this way. A modest temple to Hathor or Isis might control only a few fields, but it still functioned as a center of local authority. Villagers came not just to pray, but to settle disputes, record contracts, or seek medicine. In a land without lawyers or doctors in the modern sense, the temple was the mediator of almost everything. The quiet work of craftsmen beyond the temple walls, Egypt's craftsmen labored in steady anonymity. The grand tombs of Thebes and Saqqara were not built by slaves, as old myths suggest, but by teams of skilled laborers. Many lived in planned settlements like Deir el-Medina, one of the best documented working communities of the ancient world. Here, every house was nearly identical, narrow, one-story dwellings built along a single street, with courtyards, cooking areas, and small shrines. The walls bore graffiti, sketches, jokes, prayers, the ancient echoes of human boredom. The workers' days were structured, their wages paid in rations, about 4 to 5 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of beer per day, along with occasional fish, vegetables, or dates. Payment delays were common. In fact, one of the world's first recorded labor strikes occurred here, during the reign of Ramses III. When rations failed to arrive, the tomb workers laid down their tools and marched to the nearby temples, demanding food. Their protest was peaceful, polite even, but persistent. Eventually, the administrators relented and distributed supplies. It was a small act of rebellion, and a reminder that even in a land of gods and kings, hunger could move history. The art of order. If you entered a workshop, you would see the discipline of craft. A sculptor shaping limestone, a painter mixing pigments, each step prescribed by tradition. The walls of tombs and temples were filled not with random art, but with precise formulas. Every figure followed rules of proportion. Every gesture had meaning. The left leg forward, a sign of movement. The size of a person, a sign of importance. Even color carried symbolism: red for vitality, green for growth, blue for creation. To us, it might seem repetitive, but to the Egyptian, this repetition was a kind of immortality. By adhering to convention, they ensured continuity. A visual mark. To innovate too much was to risk disorder. And yet, within those rigid forms, there was room for quiet individuality. A craftsman might leave his own likeness hidden among the figures, or include a favorite animal in the border of a scene. These small signatures, unnoticed for millennia, are whispers of real people, artisans who labored not for fame, but for the endurance of beauty. The scribes of death. While the living kept the world in motion, the dead demanded their own attention. Tombs were the final, permanent homes of Egypt's elite, carefully planned estates for eternity. For an ordinary person, burial might be modest: a shallow grave, a simple wooden coffin, perhaps a few pots of food. For the wealthy, it was an enterprise that could last years. The tomb required masons, painters, carpenters, and priests. The walls had to be inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, guiding the soul through the afterlife. The process of mummification, though famous, was not mystical. It was work, slow, methodical, and deeply bureaucratic. The embalmers removed the organs, dried the body with natron, wrapped it in linen, and catalogued each amulet placed between the layers. Some embalmers left written inventories, noting each step completed. The dead, too, were managed like a ledger. In the tomb chapels, offerings were made by family or hired priests: bread, beer, meat, incense, all meant to sustain the spirit. Sometimes the family would visit on feast days, cleaning the tomb, leaving flowers, and talking to the departed as though they still listened. The line between life and death was thin. The afterlife was not a distant realm, but an extension of the world one knew. A land of scribbles and seals. You could trace Egypt's history not through its pharaohs, but through its paperwork. A letter from one official to another might concern missing copper tools or a shipment of grain lost in transit. Some papyri record inspections of tombs long after their construction, complaints of theft, investigations into missing goods, reports of priests accused of stealing jewelry from mummies. Even the famous tomb of Tutankhamun was not safe from this administrative net. The tomb's seals bear the imprint of the necropolis officials who closed it. Their job was to ensure that even the king's rest was properly documented. Seals, in fact, were everywhere, small lumps of clay pressed with a scarab or cylinder, bearing the name of an official. These seals were the signatures of trust. A sealed jar, a sealed door, a sealed scroll, all were promises of integrity. And yet, each seal also implied surveillance. Someone somewhere always kept count. The burden of order for all its splendor, Egypt was a system of relentless maintenance. Fields had to be measured, canals dredged, temples supplied, tombs guarded. The moment one harvest ended, preparations began for the next. And through it all, the people endured, not through heroism, but through repetition. Their resilience lay not in grand deeds, but in daily acts: the steady stroke of a quill, the rhythmic scrape of a hoe, the measured chant of a priest. To live in ancient Egypt was to live inside a vast, humming order. Every person from the pharaoh to the field hand was a cog in the divine mechanism. Few questioned it. To question was to risk effete, chaos, the unmaking of the world. Yet one wonders in the quiet of the night, when the wind rustled through the reeds and the stars reflected on the Nile. Did any of them feel the weight of this endless order pressing too tightly? Did anyone ever long, even secretly, for something unpredictable? For a flood that did not come, a day that broke the pattern. Night falls softly on the Nile. The air cools, the river darkens, and a hush spreads over the fields. A faint breeze carries the smell of damp earth and smoke from cooking fires. If you were standing there, thousands of years ago, you would feel something timeless, as though the night itself was the same one your great-grandparents had known. Because for the ancient Egyptians it was. Their world was not one of progress or invention in the way we think of it now. It was a world of cycles. The river flooded, the crops grew, the people labored, and the gods were fed. The sun died each evening and was reborn at dawn. Time did not move forward, it moved in circles, graceful, unending circles. And at the center of that circle was death. The mirror of eternity to an Egyptian, death was not an ending, but a mirror held up to life. The world of the living and the world of the dead reflected one another. What you did in life, plowing fields, baking bread, fishing, weaving, you would continue to do in the afterlife. But this was not seen as punishment. It was comfort, stability, the idea that the universe would always behave as it should. When a person died, their body was treated not with fear but with care. Death was a continuation, not a rupture. Family members washed the body, sometimes even participating in the early stages of preparation before the embalmers took over. The organs were removed and placed in canopic jars, guarded by 4 deities: Imseti, Hopi, Dwamutef, and Kebesanuf. Each one protected a part of the body: the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was left inside. It would later be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth and order, in the hall of judgment. If it balanced perfectly, the soul could pass peacefully into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. If it was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Amit, the monstrous goddess, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. But in truth, few Egyptians believed they would fail. The proper rituals, prayers, and spells, all written carefully on papyrus or painted on the walls of the tomb, ensured a safe passage. The bureaucracy of death mirrored that of life, detailed, organized, endlessly documented. The field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, was not a glittering heaven filled with clouds. It was a perfect Egypt. The same Nile, the same crops, the same daily labor, only easier, eternal, and without hunger or pain. You would farm, yes, but the soil would always be fertile. You would eat, but never grow tired. In many tombs, small figurines called shabtis were placed alongside the dead. These were servants for the afterlife, meant to work on behalf of the deceased. Each shabti held a tiny hoe or basket, ready to plow and harvest in eternity. Over time, wealthier Egyptians filled their tombs with hundreds of these figurines, a small army of laborers for the world beyond. Even the gods were bureaucratic in the afterlife. There were courts, records, and witnesses. The dead presented themselves before Osiris, lord of the underworld, to recite the negative confession, a list of 42 denials of sin: I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not uttered lies, I have not withheld milk from a child. It was less a prayer and more a declaration of compliance. Proof that one had upheld Ma'at in life. It is easy to imagine the solemnity of it. the quiet echo of the afterlife's courtroom, the shimmering presence of gods, and the hopeful weight of the feather. But perhaps, in the Egyptian imagination, this judgment was not terrifying at all. It was merely another record to be filed, another account to be balanced. Tombs as memory machines back among the living. The tombs themselves became instruments of memory. Even the simplest grave had a purpose: to preserve a name. To be remembered was to continue existing. The Egyptians believed that a person had several parts: the Ka life force, the Bi personality, and the Ren names. The Ka needed offerings, the Ba could move between worlds, but the Ren, the name, was the key to survival. If your name was spoken, you lived. If it was forgotten, you truly died. This is why names appear everywhere, carved into walls, written on pots, scratched into stone. The pharaoh's name was repeated endlessly, not only as pride but as insurance. Even in the tomb of an ordinary scribe, you would find his name carefully recorded again and again, in hope that someone, someday, might still speak it. You can feel this belief in the meticulousness of their art. Every painted loaf, every carved ox, every jar of beer on the wall of a tomb was not decoration. It was a real provision for eternity. The images themselves held power. The tomb was a functioning house for the afterlife, not a mere memorial. And yet, over centuries, sand swallowed these tombs. The names faded. The prayers went unanswered. The Ka and Ba lost their way. The bureaucracy of eternity, like that of life, slowly decayed. The silence of forgotten gods. As centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell. The flood patterns changed. Foreigners came, Persians, Greeks, Romans, each adapting Egypt's rituals to their own beliefs. Temples that once thrummed with incense and chanting fell silent. Priests who had once bathed 3 times a day and anointed statues with oil now had no one to serve. The statues themselves, left untended, cracked and faded. The carefully recorded rituals, the offerings of bread and beer, ceased. But Egypt's people, the farmers, the potters, the scribes, went on. The Nile still flooded. The same bread was baked, the same beer brewed. Even as gods and kings changed, daily life endured. The machinery of order outlived those who built it. It is strange, perhaps, that this civilization, so focused on eternity, eventually became a ruin. The very things that made it stable, its devotion to repetition, its distrust of change, also made it vulnerable to time. The cycles could not last forever. Echoes in the sand today, the wind still blows over the same riverbanks, lifting sand from the edges of long, buried tombs. Archaeologists brush away centuries of dust to uncover the quiet traces of ordinary lives: a half-finished letter, a worn grinding stone, a basket still holding dried grains. These remnants are not the grand monuments we imagine when we think of Egypt. They are small, human, and deeply ordinary. Yet in them, we hear whispers of resilience, the ability of people to live within the confines of duty, to find meaning in repetition, to build beauty in predictability. Consider the grinding stone once more, the steady motion, day after day, producing flour for bread that would be eaten by people whose names are now forgotten. The work itself was not glorious, but it sustained empires. Egypt's history, when stripped of its gold and its gods, is the story of endurance. A civilization that lasted over 3,000 years was not built on conquest or innovation alone, but on the quiet stability of people who kept going, who woke at dawn, worked under the sun, rested at night, and believed that doing so maintained the balance of the universe. The river still flows. If you stood now at the edge of the Nile, the modern Nile, shimmering under electric lights and the buzz of distant cities, and closed your eyes, you might still feel something ancient beneath the surface. The water that passes by is the same water that once flooded the fields of those who built the pyramids. It is the same current that carried papyrus boats, washed the feet of scribes, and cooled the bodies of children playing near its banks. The river endures, indifferent, eternal, patient. Egypt's people once believed that the gods sailed the sun across the sky in a great bark, battling darkness each night and triumphing each dawn. Perhaps, in a way, they were right. The cycles still continue. The light still returns. The weight of time we measure history in grand epochs, kingdoms, empires, revolutions. But Egypt teaches something slower, quieter. That civilization is not only built by the powerful, but by the persistent, by those who do the same thing well, day after day, even when no one remembers their names. The farmer tilling the silted soil, the woman grinding grain in the shade, the scribe copying figures onto papyrus, the priest bathing a stone statue in silence. Together, they kept a world alive for millennia. So, when you think of ancient Egypt, think not only of pyramids and pharaohs, but of the countless lives spent maintaining the fragile balance of Ma'at. lives so ordinary that they became extraordinary through their endurance. And perhaps that is the truest lesson they left behind, that the most lasting legacies are often the quietest ones. Before the first light touches the stone walls, a bell rings, soft at first, then echoing through the cold corridors of the monastery. The sound rises like mist from the cloister, its vibration slipping under doors and over the narrow cots of the sleeping monks. You open your eyes. The cell is small, barely more than a stone box with a wooden bed and a simple crucifix on the wall. The air smells faintly of tallow and damp wool. There is no fire. There never is. The bell calls again. It is matins, the first prayer of the day. In the silence between the notes, you hear the shuffle of sandals, the rustle of robes. A dozen men, perhaps more, rise from their beds at once, moving without speech. You join them. The rhythm of prayer, the medieval monastery, was not just a place of faith. It was a clock, the most precise and relentless kind of clock the Middle Ages could conceive. The monks' lives were ruled by the liturgy of the hours, a sequence of 8 prayers that divided the day and night into sacred intervals. They were matins, in the deep night, sometimes as early as 2 a.m. lauds, at dawn, as the sun began to rise. Prime, the first hour of daylight. Terce, sext and none, the 3rd, 6th and 9th hours after sunrise. Vespers, at dusk. Compline, just before sleep. Together, they marked every moment of life, like stones laid across the river of time. No act, eating, reading, sleeping, was outside the pattern. When the bell rings for matins, the monastery stirs. The brothers gather in the dark church, the air thick with chill and breath. The only light comes from candles trembling in iron holders. There are no sermons, no speeches, only psalms, long, droning, beautiful in their monotony. The voices rise and fall in Latin, ancient words repeated so many times that their meaning dissolves into rhythm. The sound is not meant for human ears alone. It is meant to keep the world in balance. A different kind of mat, perhaps one that binds time to the divine through order and sound. The cloister and the cell. When the prayers end, dawn is near. You walk back through the cloister, a square courtyard enclosed by stone arches. Dew glitters on the grass. The monks move in silence, hands folded in their sleeves. Each returns to his small tasks. Some to the gardens, where herbs grow in neat rows. Others to the kitchens, where bread must be baked for the day. A few to the scriptorium, the writing room where books are copied by hand. Your own cell, when you return to it, is bare. A bed of straw, a wooden stool, a shelf holding a single candle and a book of prayers. The walls are whitewashed but uneven, the light faint. The silence is not empty. It hums as if filled with invisible breath. In the monastery, everything is designed to minimize distraction. Speech is rare. Even gestures are limited. Silence is not simply a rule, it is a form of worship. To speak too much is to risk vanity, pride, or wastefulness. Meals are taken in silence too. The brothers sit in long rows in the refectory, the dining hall, heads bowed. One monk reads aloud from a lectern, passages from scripture, or perhaps the life of a saint, while the others eat simple food, bread, cheese, a bit of vegetable stew. Sometimes there is fish, never meat. When the meal ends, a bell sounds again. Bowing, the monks rise, wash their wooden bowls, and return to work. The labor of faith, the day's labor, is as structured as its prayers. Every monastery was a self-contained world, designed to feed, clothe, and sustain itself, and to pray for those outside its walls. The monks worked not for profit but for necessity and for humility. Some tended the gardens and fields, growing vegetables, herbs, and grains. Others cared for livestock, sheep for wool, bees for honey and wax. A few were assigned to brewing ale or pressing wine. In every act, there was devotion. To hoe a row of turnips was as sacred as to copy scripture. The labor itself was a prayer, an act of alignment with God's will. Saint Benedict, whose rule guided much of monastic life, wrote that idleness is the enemy of the soul. His monks were to live by the words ora et labora, pray and work. In this simple rhythm, they found peace. Yet there was more to this peace than faith. The monastery's order protected the monks from the chaos of the outside world. Wars, famine, politics, plague. Inside the walls, life was predictable, pure, and endlessly repetitive. It was a world where nothing unexpected ever happened. The scriptorium, if you were a monk with good eyesight and steady hands, you might spend your days in the scriptorium. It was a long room, often with narrow windows to let in light but not heat. Each desk held sheets of parchment, scraped animal skin, and pots of ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Here the monks copied books slowly, painstakingly, letter by letter. The texts were mostly religious: the Bible, the Psalms, the writings of church fathers. Sometimes, though, they copied older works, Aristotle, Cicero, or Virgil, preserving fragments of a pagan world long gone. Each page was an act of devotion. Mistakes were rare but punished with penance. To write God's word required a clean heart and a steady mind. Over the hours, the scratching of quills filled the room, a sound like soft rain. The monks bent over their desks, faces pale in the candlelight, their backs aching. Yet the work never stopped. In the margins of some manuscripts, later readers have found small notes, scribbled in moments of weariness. "It is very cold today. The parchment is bad. I am so tired." These quiet complaints, centuries old, remind us that beneath the robes and rituals were human beings, doing long, dull work in service of something larger than themselves. The gardens and the infirmary outside, another brother tends the herbs, sage, thyme, and lavender, but also plants used for medicine. The monastery's infirmary is small, but it serves both monks and travelers. In a world where doctors were scarce and disease was common, monasteries became centers of healing. Monks recorded remedies in careful Latin: honey for wounds, rosemary for headaches, vinegar for fevers. Their medical books were compilations of centuries of observation, copied, annotated, and preserved in the same quiet way as scripture. The rhythm of healing, too, mirrored the rhythm of prayer. Even tending the sick was an act of devotion, performed with humility and patience. The shadows of the bell by midday, the sun warms the stone walls. The monks pause to eat again, bread, perhaps a little fruit, and all brewed within the monastery itself. Then they return to prayer, the 6th hour sext. The chants rise once more, echoing through the nave. The day stretches forward, slow and ordered. Nothing is rushed, nothing wasted. There is beauty in the stillness, but also a certain weight. For while the monks sought closeness to God through repetition, they also lived apart from the living world. Behind the monastery's gates, time seemed frozen. The same prayers, the same meals, the same silence, repeated not just for days but for decades. Some found peace in it, others perhaps found restlessness. The rules of silence left little room for doubt or desire, but even doubt was quietly folded into prayer, as if to question were itself a form of faith. As dusk approaches, the bell rings again. Vespers. The monks gather one last time before nightfall, their chants melting into the shadows. Candles flicker, casting long shapes across the walls. When compline ends and the final prayer is spoken, the monastery falls into deep silence once more. Only the river nearby continues to move, unseen beyond the walls. And as you return to your narrow bed, the bell ropes swaying faintly in the tower, you might wonder, does holiness lie in endless repetition? Or does the repetition simply keep men from thinking too much about the world beyond the cloister gate? The bell sounds again before dawn, though to you it feels as if you have not slept at all. The cold has crept in through the stone walls, and the straw mattress offers little warmth. Yet when the sound echoes through the corridor, there is no hesitation. Every monk rises. This obedience, immediate, unquestioning, is not a matter of habit alone. It is the essence of their existence, shaped by one man's vision more than 1,000 years before Benedict of Nursia. The rule of Saint Benedict around the year 530 CE. In a small monastery perched on Monte Cassino in Italy, Benedict wrote a book. It was not long, about 73 short chapters, but it would become one of the most influential texts in Western history. It was called simply The Rule. Its purpose was clear: to create a community where men could seek God through stability, obedience, and moderation. Benedict had seen other monasteries descend into chaos or pride. His rule was meant to prevent that. Under the rule, the monastery became a place of balance, neither too harsh nor too lenient. Every moment of the day was ordered, but nothing was wasted. There was work, prayer, and rest. There were times for silence and times for reading, times for manual labor and times for worship. Let all things be done with moderation, Benedict wrote. To the modern ear, the rule might sound suffocating, but to those living in a violent and unpredictable world, it was a shelter. It promised structure, peace, and meaning, a way to make every breath a form of worship. For the monks of the Middle Ages, this book was not simply a guideline. It was the foundation of their existence, copied and recited and lived day after day, century after century. Obedience and hierarchy. Every monastery was a small kingdom. At its head stood the abbot, a figure of immense authority, not by force but by moral weight. He was said to hold the place of Christ within the community, and his word was final. When the abbot spoke, even the most learned monk bowed. If he ordered a task, no matter how tedious or difficult, it was done without complaint. The monks were taught to obey, without delay, as if the command came from God himself. Below the abbot were the prior, the sub-prior, and various officers who oversaw the daily functions of the monastery, the cellarer who managed supplies, the sacristan who cared for the church, the infirmarian who tended the sick. Each had precise duties, defined by the rule. There was comfort in this order, a sense that every man, however humble, had a place in the divine machine. Still, human nature did not vanish behind the cloister walls. Some abbots were harsh, others indulgent. Some monks grumbled in silence. The rule itself allowed for correction if a brother disobeyed. He might be denied wine, or made to eat apart from the others, or sent to pray alone. In severe cases, he might be expelled, though such punishment was rare. The vows that bind: when a man entered the monastery, he gave up more than comfort. He gave up choice. Before taking his vows, a novice would spend a year in testing. He would live among the monks but not yet be one of them. He would learn the chants, the prayers, and the silence. He would rise when the bell rang and work as he was told. If, after this time, he still wished to stay, he would kneel before the abbot and recite his vows aloud. Stability, conversion of life, obedience. Stability meant he would remain in that monastery for life. No wandering, no new beginnings. Conversion of life meant he would live chastely and without possessions, renouncing all worldly attachments. Obedience bound him to the will of the abbot and the rule. When the vows were spoken, the new monk would sign his name in the monastery's book and place it upon the altar. From that moment, he belonged to the community, body and soul. Outside the walls, life was uncertain. Wars raged, kings rose and fell, villages burned. Inside, the monk's life was steady, unchanging. He knew exactly what each day would bring until his death. The economy of self-sufficiency. A medieval monastery was more than a spiritual community. It was a small, self-contained economy. A village, a farm, and a workshop combined. Because monks took vows of poverty, everything they produced belonged to the monastery, not to individuals. They grew their own food, raised their own animals, and crafted much of what they used. Many monasteries became surprisingly wealthy, not through luxury, but through skill and discipline. Their lands were well managed, their gardens were productive. They made fine cheese, oil, and wool. Pilgrims and travelers donated money for prayers. Over time, these small economies accumulated vast estates, turning monasteries into some of the most stable institutions in medieval Europe. Their wealth, however, was never meant for pleasure. Gold was used to gild altars, not goblets. Fine fabric became vestments, not clothing. The monks themselves lived in simplicity, eating from wooden bowls, sleeping in cold cells, wearing coarse habits of undyed wool. It was a peculiar kind of wealth, prosperity without possession, abundance without indulgence. The monastic year beyond the daily rhythm of prayer. The monks' lives were shaped by the liturgical year, a repeating cycle of seasons and feasts that mirrored the passing of time outside the walls. Advent led to Christmas. Lent led to Easter. Summer brought feast days of saints and martyrs. Each holy day brought changes to the chants, the readings, the food. In Lent, meals grew even simpler. Bread and water, sometimes vegetables. No wine, no oil. The austerity was not punishment but purification. When Easter came, the bells rang in joy and the monks sang louder than at any other time of year. Yet even this joy was measured, contained within the calm order of the rule. Time in the monastery was circular, not linear. Nothing truly ended. Each day repeated the last. Each year mirrored the one before. Death, too, was seen not as an end but as another turn of the circle. Death and remembrance. When a monk died, there was no mourning in the worldly sense. His death was quiet, like everything else in monastic life. The brothers washed the body, dressed it in simple robes, and laid it in the chapel. For a full day, prayers were said over him, not for his loss, but for his journey, a passage from one form of service to another. Then he was buried in the monastery's cemetery, often without a name, for names were a kind of vanity. A simple wooden cross might mark the spot, soon weathered by rain. And yet his presence lingered. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, his name would be read aloud in the chapter house, part of the long list of departed brothers. In this way, he remained within the monastery's rhythm, still prayed for, still remembered. A world apart outside the monastery, Europe shifted. Empires collapsed, new kingdoms rose, and the church itself became a political power. But inside the cloister, little changed. The monks lived as they always had, chanting, copying, working. Their walls grew moss, their bells aged, but the rhythm continued. Theirs was a world apart, untouched by the noise of battle or the bustle of trade. And yet, paradoxically, they were the keepers of civilization. The books they copied preserved the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Their herbal remedies carried ancient medical knowledge through the Dark Ages. Their calendars and clocks set the rhythm of medieval time. It was not the knights or kings who kept Europe alive through its quiet centuries, but men like these, anonymous, silent, patient. Still, one might wonder in their pursuit of divine order, what did they lose of the human? When a man spends 40 years in the same stone cell, saying the same prayers, seeing the same faces, does he grow closer to God, or does he disappear into the rhythm itself? The monastery, you notice, is never entirely silent. Even when the brothers sleep, there is a hum beneath the stillness. The whisper of wind through arches, the creak of old wood, the drip of water from the cloister roof into a stone basin. But in this final century of the Middle Ages, something else begins to stir beyond the monastery walls. The world outside is waking, and its voice is growing louder. The slow erosion of silence. For nearly 1,000 years, monasteries had been the engines of European faith. Their chants marked time, their books preserved learning, their discipline gave structure to the church itself. But by the late 14th century, cracks were forming in that quiet foundation. Trade was growing, towns were swelling. Merchants and craftsmen now lived lives far more active and far more prosperous than many abbots. The rise of universities created a new kind of learning, one that valued argument and debate over obedience and tradition. Even within the church, voices of reform began to whisper that the monasteries had grown too comfortable, too wealthy, too distant from the spiritual poverty they once embraced. And they were not entirely wrong. Many large abbeys now owned vast tracts of land, collecting rents and tithes from farmers. Some monks, particularly those of high birth, lived in relative ease. Gold illuminated their manuscripts and imported wine filled their cellars. Still, even as decadence crept in, the rhythm of bells continued. The faithful brothers still woke before dawn, still tended the gardens, still prayed for the world. But history, once again, was moving outside their walls. The dawn of change in England, the 14th and 15th centuries, brought both devastation and transformation. The Black Death wiped out nearly half the population, leaving empty villages and abandoned farms. Monasteries, too, suffered. Whole communities of monks perished, their libraries left untended. Yet even in tragedy their role endured. During the plague, many monasteries became hospitals. Their infirmaries filled not only with brothers but with townsfolk seeking care and prayer. Monks recorded the spread of disease in neat Latin script, counting the dead by the thousands, praying that each name might find rest. Still, the losses left scars. Fewer monks meant fewer hands to work the land or copy books. Some monasteries fell into ruin, others merged or were abandoned altogether. The world that emerged after the plague was less certain of its faith, more hungry for worldly knowledge. A new art was being born, the art of printing, and with it, the slow death of the scriptorium. For centuries, the patient hands of monks had preserved knowledge one letter at a time. Now, with the invention of the printing press around 1450, a single machine could produce more books in a week than an entire monastery could in a decade. The scriptorium fell silent. The quills were set down. The humming of the press, loud, mechanical, relentless, replaced the scratch of ink on parchment. Knowledge, once sacred and rare, was becoming common. The closing of the gates by the early 16th century, the world's pulse had quickened. Kings were consolidating power, explorers were mapping the edges of the earth, and the church, once unified under the Latin tongue of Rome, was about to fracture. The Reformation came like a storm. When Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in 1517, he struck not only at papal authority, but at the very institutions that had defined Christian life for centuries, including the monasteries. In Protestant lands, monasticism was declared unnecessary, even corrupt. The idea of men withdrawing from the world to pray for its salvation was dismissed as idleness. Salvation, Luther argued, came by faith alone, not through cloistered ritual. The response was swift and brutal. In England, King Henry VII dissolved the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, seizing their lands and treasures. Over 800 religious houses were closed. Their libraries were looted, their bells melted down, their monks and nuns turned out into the streets. Some found work as parish priests or teachers. Others simply vanished into the countryside, their lives of order replaced by uncertainty. The monasteries, once islands of silence, became ruins. Ivy climbed their walls, and sheep grazed in their courtyards. Only the stones remained, still faintly echoing the rhythm of the old bells. Echoes of the past, yet the monastic ideal never truly died. Even as the great abbeys fell, smaller communities of monks and nuns continued across Europe, adapting quietly to new times. Some turned outward, teaching healing or serving the poor. Others retreated deeper into solitude. Their influence lingered in ways less visible but deeply enduring. The architecture of monasteries shaped universities. Their schedules became the basis for modern clocks and calendars. Even our notion of the workday, divided into hours, marked by bells, descends from the monastic rhythm of prayer and labor. And though the printing press silenced the scriptorium, the monks' careful preservation of ancient texts ensured that Western civilization had something to print at all. Without their slow, meticulous copying, the words of Plato, Aristotle, Galen, and Augustine might have vanished. The world of science and philosophy that followed would have been built on sand. The modern monastic rhythm today, a few monasteries still follow the rule of Saint Benedict much as they did a millennium ago. They rise before dawn, chant the psalms, eat in silence, and work the land. Their lives move in cycles of prayer and quiet labor, but the world outside has become louder, faster, impossible to ignore. And yet, perhaps that is why these places still hold power. They remind us that there was once another pace to existence, one not measured in minutes or profits, but in patience and breath. If you were to visit one of these monasteries now, you might still hear the same tones of vespers echoing through the stone halls, the same words whispered by candlelight. The Latin may no longer be widely understood, but the sound itself carries something timeless, a thread that connects centuries of human longing, from the scribes of Monte Cassino to the few quiet monks who remain today. The question that lingers, so as the last candle burns low in our imagined cloister, and the night gathers once again around the stone walls, you might think back on those countless lives lived in repetition and silence. They sought meaning not in change, but in constancy. They believed that by perfecting a single day, by praying the same prayers, walking the same paths, keeping the same hours, they could touch eternity. In a sense, they succeeded. The world that moved on without them still keeps time by their rhythm, and perhaps that is the quiet triumph of the monasteries, that their greatest legacy is not their buildings or their wealth, but their example, a reminder that the ordinary, when done with devotion, can outlast empires. Still, one question remains, hanging in the air like the final toll of the bell. When the world learned to move faster, to speak louder, to reach farther, did it lose something that only silence could teach? You wake to the sound of wood creaking and waves slapping against the hull, not violently, but steadily, like breathing. It is still dark below deck, and the air smells of tar, salt, and sweat. Around you, the others stir slowly, the hammock swaying gently in rhythm with the sea. It is another day aboard the Mersey of London, a merchant ship bound for Lisbon by way of the Bay of Biscay. You've been at sea for 37 days. The last sight of land has long faded from memory. The ship as a world, a merchant ship of the 17th century, was more than a vessel. It was a tiny, floating civilization. Everything that existed within its hull had to sustain itself for weeks or months: men, food, tools, and trust. The Mersey is a 3-masted ship of about 250 tons, not large by naval standards, but big enough to carry hundreds of barrels of goods: English wool, tin and cloth on the outbound leg, Portuguese wine, salt and spices on the return. The deck is crowded with ropes, casks, and the occasional chicken or goat brought aboard to provide fresh meat. The ship's bell marks time in half-hour increments, the watches by which the sailors measure their lives. 6 watches divide the day and night: the middle watch, midnight to 4 a.m., the morning watch, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., the forenoon watch, 8 a.m. to noon, the afternoon watch, then 4 p.m., the first dog watch, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m., and the second dog watch, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., and then the cycle repeats. For sailors, time at sea is not measured in days, but in these watches, endless rotations of duty, rest, and repetition. Morning on the open sea at first light, the deck comes alive. The sun lifts slowly over the horizon, painting the sails pale gold. The sea stretches unbroken in every direction, calm for now. You and the other men begin your duties, scrubbing the deck with sand and seawater, checking the rigging for frayed lines, and greasing the pulleys. The boatswain, a thick-voiced man named Briggs, barks orders in a tone that brooks no hesitation. There is no romance in this labor. Sailors of the merchant fleet worked hard, and often without pay until the voyage's end. Discipline was strict, though less brutal than aboard warships. The captain ruled by necessity. The sea left little room for democracy. You work barefoot for better grip, your skin salt, crusted, your hands raw from rope. A faint film of tar covers everything: your clothes, your hair, your skin. It's a smell that will cling long after you reach land again. The rhythm of rations at 8 bells. The end of the morning watch. Breakfast is served. There is no table, no ceremony. A sailor's meal is plain and repetitive. Hardtack biscuits, so hard they must be soaked in water or oil before eating, salted beef or pork, and sometimes peas or oatmeal. The biscuits are riddled with weevils, but hunger dulls disgust. Each man receives a ration of ale or watered wine, safer than the ship's stale water, which quickly turns green in the casks. Fresh food runs out within the first week at sea. After that, meals are more about survival than taste. The salt meat must be boiled repeatedly to soften it, and the water used for cooking is rationed by the pint. Yet even this monotony is part of the rhythm of life at sea. Eating together, grumbling about the food, laughing over the same old jokes. It builds a sense of shared endurance. The work never ends after the meal. You climb the rigging with two others to inspect the topsails. From above, the ship looks small, a fragile speck on an endless blue plain. The ropes bite into your hands as you haul on the lines, adjusting the angle of the canvas to catch the wind. Each knot, each turn is muscle memory now. There is comfort in the repetition. Below, the carpenter hammers at a loose plank. The cooper checks the barrels for leaks. The cook, sweating beside his small brick galley, prepares the noon meal, another round of salted meat and biscuit. The rest of the crew clean, mend, or stand watch. Even when the sea is calm, there is always something to do: patching sails, repairing ropes, scraping barnacles from the hull, or simply waiting for orders. A ship that stops moving soon becomes dangerous. Wood swells, ropes rot, tempers fray. Weather and superstition. When clouds gather on the horizon, the air shifts. The older sailors read the wind like scripture, watching how it curls the surface of the water, feeling the humidity on their skin. They mutter small prayers to Saint Nicholas, patron of sailors, or tie knots in the ropes as charms. Though the captain carries charts and a compass, faith and superstition still rule much of life at sea. No one whistles on deck. It is said to summon the wind too fiercely. No one kills a seabird, especially an albatross, for it carries the souls of drowned sailors. At night, when the sea glows faintly with phosphorescence and the stars stretch from horizon to horizon, even the most hardened men grow quiet. The ocean is vast beyond comprehension, a presence that humbles and unsettles. The sound of the ship to the landsman, the ship would seem full of noised, creaking beams, the groan of rigging, the slap of waves. But to those who live aboard, these are the sounds of life, a kind of music. The rhythm of the timbers tells you if the wind is steady. The pitch of the ropes tells you if a sail is too tight. The ocean's voice becomes your clock and compass. At night, lying in your hammock, you listen to the creak and sigh of the hull, the muffled steps of the watch above. Sometimes you hear laughter or snatches of song, more often, just the sea. It is a sound that seeps into your bones until you can no longer imagine silence without it. The dangers unseen. The ocean, for all its calm beauty, hides its dangers well. Storms can rise without warning. A single mistake in sail or rigging can capsize the ship. There are other threats too: fire, disease, mutiny. A lantern dropped carelessly in the hold could ignite the tarred wood and pitch. Fire at sea is feared above all else. Scurvy, caused by the lack of fresh food, slowly weakens the men. Bleeding gums, swollen joints, a constant fatigue that no rest can cure. Even boredom can turn deadly. Weeks of monotony strain tempers. A careless insult, a stolen ration, a missed order, and fists fly. Yet for all this, most voyages end not in disaster, but in wary success. The sea's true danger is not sudden death, but endless endurance. The horizon never changes as days pass. The world seems to dissolve into sameness. The sky, the sea, the wind, all blur together. The only changes are subtle: the angle of the sun, the flight of birds, the color of the water. You begin to lose track of time. Was that storm last week or last month? Have you crossed the Bay of Biscay yet, or still drift along its edge? The only constant is the horizon, that distant, unbroken line that never draws closer. At sunset, when the light bleeds into the waves and the bell rings for the evening watch, you might lean against the rail and watch the sky darken. The others move about their work quietly. Some hum songs from home. Some speak softly of ports they've never seen. Most say nothing at all. The sea does not care. It rolls on, indifferent, endless. And as the stars emerge, countless, cold, familiar, you might wonder, how many others before you have stood here, staring at the same horizon, waiting for land that never seems to appear. The bell strikes 4 times. The end of another morning watch. The sound echoes across the deck, dull and metallic, swallowed by the wind. You have been awake for hours, though you could not say how many. Sleep and wakefulness blur into one another at sea, divided only by duty. The sun climbs over the horizon, pale and thin. The waves roll gently, like the breath of some great sleeping creature. Another day begins. The routine deepens. Life aboard a 17th century merchant ship is not measured in events but in repetitions. Each task repeats so often it becomes instinct, tying a knot, hoisting a line, checking a compass. The monotony is both comfort and curse. There is safety in knowing exactly what must be done, and danger in having too much time to think. The crew of the Mercy of London numbers 20, 8 men sailors, apprentices, a carpenter, a cooper, a cook, and a small detachment of armed guards to deter pirates. Above them all stands the captain, stern but fair, his authority absolute. You do not speak much to him. Ordinary sailors seldom do. Orders pass down through the mates, then through the boatswain, until they reach you as a short command: reef the topsail, or scrub the deck. Each man knows his place. Discipline is the ship's spine. Without it, chaos would sink the vessel long before any storm could. The taste of the voyage food remains the constant preoccupation of sailors. Each day's ration is nearly identical to the last. Salted beef or pork, hardtack, dried peas, and Nile. The meat is so salty it must be soaked in water before cooking. The biscuits are infested with weevils. To some this might sound miserable, but at sea, routine meals are a kind of stability. You know what to expect, and hunger dulls any complaint. Occasionally, if a passing school of fish is caught, or a seabird is trapped with a line, there is a rare feast, a brief reminder of freshness. On those days spirits lift, songs break out across the deck. For a moment, the voyage feels almost human again. Still, sickness always hovers near. The stale air below deck, the lack of fresh fruit or vegetables, and the damp conditions breed scurvy and fever. The surgeon, more barber than doctor, does what he can. His instruments, knives, saws, and leeches lie in a wooden chest. The smell of vinegar and blood marks his small corner of the hold. When a man falls ill, he is laid in a hammock strung low to prevent injury if the ship rolls. If he dies, the service is brief: a prayer, a canvas shroud, and a splash as the body slides into the sea. The waves close quickly. Within moments, the surface is smooth again. The work and the wind. By midday, the sun glares overhead, and the deck radiates heat. The sea glitters with deceptive calm. The sails hang heavy, catching only faint traces of wind. Calm seas, some say with relief. But calm is the sailor's enemy. A ship without wind cannot move, and a ship that cannot move becomes trapped. The stillness stretches for hours, sometimes days. The sun beats down relentlessly. The tar softens on the ropes. The water in the barrels grows hotter and tempers rise. Men pace the deck in silence. The captain studies the horizon, his jaw clenched. The crew pray for a breeze, any breeze, to break the suffocating quiet. When the wind finally comes, it arrives suddenly, a rush of cool air that sends the sails snapping taut. The crew leaps to their posts, hauling lines, shouting orders. The ship surges forward once more, groaning as it cuts through the waves. The relief is palpable, though no one says it aloud. The labor of maintenance a ship at sea is in constant decay. Salt eats the wood, wind frays the ropes, and dampness seeps into every seam. Every day, men are sent to patch, scrape, and hammer. The carpenter moves like a doctor tending a patient, listening to the hull for signs of weakness. A hollow echo means rot. A soft creak might signal a loose joint. The sails, too, require endless care. Torn canvas must be stitched with heavy needles, hands thick with colluses. The rigging is tarred to prevent rot, the masts checked for cracks. It is work without end, one that gives the illusion of control over a force that can never truly be controlled. The sounds of the sea at night. The ocean takes on its own strange music. The planks creak like sighs, ropes thrum in the wind. Far below, waves slap the hull in rhythmic patterns. Sometimes, in the darkest hours, sailors claim to hear other sounds. Faint bells ringing under the water, or whispers carried on the wind. They speak of ghost ships and drowned men, of lights that follow in the wake like souls refusing rest. Superstition fills the empty spaces where reason cannot reach. One sailor keeps a small piece of coal tied around his neck to ward off evil. Another refuses to speak the word pig aboard ship. A curse, he insists, that brings storms. No one mocks these beliefs. The sea has a way of humbling those who laugh at its mysteries. The men and their world in quieter moments. When the sea is calm and the work done, the sailors gather near the forecastle. Someone pulls out a fiddle, another claps a rhythm, and a shanty rises into the night air. The songs are old, tales of home ports, lost loves, and endless voyages. They are not cheerful, but steady, rhythmic, meant to keep hands moving and minds occupied. Laughter comes easily in these moments, though it fades just as quickly. Each man knows how far he is from home. There are no letters at sea, no word from family, no certainty of return. Each voyage might end in profit or oblivion. The ocean keeps its secrets. The captain's log every evening. The captain writes by lantern light in his logbook. His entries are spare, factual: latitude 44 degrees north, wind steady southwest, course due south by west, all well aboard. But behind those simple lines lie weeks of endurance, hunger, sickness, fear, monotony. The written record reduces human experience to numbers and headings, as if to tame the chaos of the sea. The log will survive even if the men do not. The unseen world below. Once in calm waters, the ship's carpenter drops a line weighted with lead into the depths. When he pulls it up, it is covered with pale mud. The sailors crowd around to see it, the only proof they ever have that something exists below. For most of them, the ocean floor is as distant as the moon. They know the sky better than the world beneath their feet. Sometimes dolphins follow the ship, leaping in its wake, their movements graceful and deliberate. The men take it as a good omen. Other times, great shadows pass beneath the hull, whales, or perhaps something else. No one can be sure. The sea is too vast to know. Days without measure, weeks pass. The coastline of Spain should be near, but clouds hide the stars, and the wind drives the ship in uncertain directions. Each day begins and ends the same way: the ringing of bells, the creak of wood, the smell of salt and sweat. It becomes difficult to remember why you set out at all. The promise of wages, perhaps, or adventure, or simply the necessity of survival. But at sea, such reasons lose meaning. The ocean demands patience, not purpose, and as another grey dawn breaks, you realize you no longer count the days by the calendar, but by the feel of the air. Cooler now, perhaps signaling approach to land. The others sense it too. There's a faint tension in the crew, an awareness that the voyage's monotony is nearing its end, and with it, the fragile order that keeps men calm. For the longer a ship sails, the more its peace depends on faith. Faith in the captain, in the weather, in one another. But what happens when that faith begins to crack? The morning light falls differently today. You notice it the moment you climb onto the deck. The air feels drier, warmer, and it carries a smell that no one mistakes: earth. Someone cries out from the foremast, "Land ho!" The call spreads like fire through the crew. Faces once dulled by monotony brighten. Men climb the rigging to see for themselves, straining their eyes toward the thin, hazy line on the horizon. After months of grey emptiness, even a faint suggestion of land seems miraculous. The promise of return, the captain says little. He stands near the wheel, watching the coastline come into focus. To him, land means work. Negotiating passage, unloading cargo, securing fresh provisions. To the men it means release, a return to solid ground, to noise, to freedom. You can see the faint outline of hills, a patch of white buildings along the shore, the suggestion of trees. But landfall is never simple. The sea guards its edges jealously. Shoals and hidden rocks wait beneath the surface. To reach the harbour safely, the captain orders soundings to be taken every few minutes. The leadsman leans over the bow, casts his line, and calls out the depth. By the mark, 5. Then again, by the deep, 4, and each call echoes across the deck like a heartbeat, slow and steady. The sails are reefed. The ship glides forward carefully, cautious even now. The ritual of arrival, when at last the harbour takes shape. It appears not as a welcoming place, but as a busy, complicated one. Dozens of ships lie at anchor, merchantmen, fishing boats, small coastal traders. The air smells of smoke and salt, pitch and fish. Seagulls cry overhead. The crew works quickly, lowering the anchor, coiling lines, furling sails. The sound of the anchor chain rattling out is deafening after months of ocean quiet. Then silence. The heavy, unfamiliar silence of stillness. The ship no longer moves. You feel the strangeness immediately. For so long, the constant motion beneath your feet was normal. Now, standing on a steady deck, you almost sway with the phantom rhythm of the sea. The captain descends to his cabin to prepare his papers. The first mate checks the cargo barrels of cloth, spices, and goods from foreign ports, each to be accounted for and taxed. On deck, the men stare toward the docks. The city waits there, full of noise, markets, and faces that do not know the voyage you've endured. The world ashore, when you finally step off the gangplank, the solid ground feels wrong beneath your boots. It takes hours for your legs to stop moving, as if the earth itself was still shifting. The port is alive with motion. Dockhands shout, horses pull wagons, women sell bread and fish. Children chase each other between barrels. The smells, fresh, sharp, overwhelming, make you dizzy. After so long among the same few dozen men, the crowd feels like another kind of sea, unpredictable and vast. The taverns are already full of sailors. Some drink to celebrate, others to forget. Within hours, coin changes hands. Fights break out, laughter fills the air. But for most of the crew, the excitement fades quickly. They are paid their wages, or promised them, depending on the captain's honesty, and begin looking for the next ship. Because at sea, endings are temporary. A sailor without a voyage is a man without a world. The true cargo, while the merchants argue over prices and the captain meets with officials, the ship's carpenter stays aboard. He repairs the wear of the journey, cracked beams, split planks, frayed ropes. He works without complaint, as he always has. For him, the ship itself is home. The sound of hammer and saw comforts him more than any tavern song. Below deck, the cooper checks the barrels. The salt has hardened the wood, the metal hoops have rusted. He notes which can be reused, which must be replaced. Even after landfall, their work continues, because the ship must be ready, always ready, for the next departure. The unseen hands of history, you might wonder who these men were, their names, their faces, their stories. But history seldom keeps such records. Official documents note only the ship's name, its tonnage, its cargo, and its captain. The sailors, unless they mutinied or perished dramatically, vanish into anonymity. And yet it was these men, nameless, weathered, ordinary, who carried the trade and empire of their time. Every grain of spice that reached a European table, every bolt of cloth, every letter sent across oceans existed because of men who scrubbed decks, patched sails, and counted the stars. Theirs was not the glory of conquest, but the endurance of repetition. They kept the world turning while barely being noticed. The memory of the sea for weeks after the voyage ends. You still hear the sounds of the ship at night, the creak of ropes, the sigh of waves, the low hum of wind in the rigging. When you walk through narrow streets, you feel the walls close in. The air smells wrong, too dry, too still. Some men cannot bear it. They spend their pay quickly and sign aboard another ship within days. Others stay marry, open small shops, tell stories in the tavern that grow grander with each retelling. But even they sometimes pause mid-sentence, eyes distant, hearing something only they can recall, the endless rhythm of the sea. The ocean never truly releases those who have lived upon it. The price of distance. Months later, a letter arrives, a notice of another voyage. A merchant is hiring hands for a run to the Indies. Good pay, fair captain, they say. You read it, and for a moment, the smell of salt seems to return. You remember the mornings of wind and cold, the endless horizon, the simple comfort of knowing what each day would bring. The land is safe, but it lacks the quiet order of the ship. You hesitate, then fold the letter and slip it away. Some journeys, you realize, never truly end. Because for those who once lived between sky and water, the rhythm of the waves becomes a heartbeat. And long after the world has forgotten your name, the sea will still whisper its own. Vast, patient, eternal. Epilogue. The endless horizon. The ship, newly repaired, waits in the harbor again. Its sails are furled, its decks scrubbed clean. Another crew will come aboard soon, men different in name but alike in purpose. They will raise the anchor, catch the wind, and set out into the same old expanse. The ocean will greet them as it has greeted all before, indifferent, immense, and alive. Some will return, some will not. But their days, measured in bells, ropes, and tides, will become another forgotten rhythm in the long music of history. For history is not made only by kings and conquerors, but by those who worked without rest, whose hands shaped the quiet foundations of the world. Their stories drift like salt on the air, invisible, but everywhere. And perhaps that is the truest kind of permanence, not being remembered by name, but by the unending labor that kept the world afloat. The waves rise and fall. The wind sighs softly. The ship leans forward, eager once more to move. The sea waits, and so the story of the sailor begins again. You are standing in upstate New York in the year 1817. The air smells of wet earth and horses, and the ground beneath your boots is soft from spring rain. Before you stretches a line of staked-out ground, a promise written into the landscape, not yet fulfilled. It does not look like the beginning of a revolution. And yet, in time, this shallow trench will come to define an age. The Erie Canal, it will be called, a 363-mile-long waterway stretching from Albany on the Hudson River to Buffalo on the shores of Lake Erie. When complete, it will link the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, binding the young United States together in ways no one quite imagines yet. But first it must be dug, by hand. And that is where the story begins, not with politicians or merchants, but with the men and women who spent years knee-deep in mud. The audacity of dirt. To the citizens of New York in 1817, the idea of a canal across the state seemed almost absurd. The land was rough and uneven, filled with forests, swamps, and glacial ridges. The skeptics called it Clinton's Ditch, mocking Governor DeWitt Clinton, who championed the project. They said it would cost a fortune, take decades, and serve no purpose. After all, America was vast but empty. Why dig a trench through wilderness when there were rivers, roads, and open land enough for 1,000 lifetimes? But Clinton had a vision. He believed that connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes would turn New York into the center of American trade. Goods could move from the western frontier to the Atlantic faster and cheaper than ever before. The dream was bold. The execution was slow. No one had ever attempted such a thing in America. There were no engineering schools, no trained canal builders, no machines to move the earth. Every measurement, every curve, every lock and aqueduct had to be planned by men who had never seen a canal before, except in books from England. Still, they began. The laborers, the work crews came from everywhere. Irish immigrants, farmhands from New England, displaced Native Americans, freed black laborers, a mixed army bound by exhaustion and necessity. Each morning they rose before dawn, ate a meal of bread and salted pork, and trudged to the digging sites. Their tools were simple shovels, picks, wheelbarrows, and black powder for blasting through stone. The pay was low, about 80 cents a day, sometimes less, and the work relentless. Mosquitoes swarmed in the summer, frostbitten hands stiffened in the winter, and disease carried off the weak. Malaria, fever, and dysentery were constant companions. And yet they dug. They dug through forest and rock, across marsh and ridge. They leveled hills, built embankments, and cut channels by hand. The noise of the work was steady. The thud of shovels, the clatter of wagons, the creak of leather harnesses. The air was thick with dust and curses. The men called it ditch work. But it was more than that. It was the transformation of wilderness into order, one measured foot at a time. The rhythm of the canal progress was slow. A mile of canal might take months. The crews advanced in short, uneven bursts, a few dozen yards a week, sometimes less. Surveyors walked ahead, measuring with chains and compasses, marking the line to follow. Behind them came the diggers, the carpenters building locks, and the masons shaping stone. Each section of canal had its own small society, a cook tent, a blacksmith, a camp where men slept on straw or bare ground. In the evenings they gathered around fires, boots steaming, clothes stiff with mud. The talk was of home, of pay, of the endlessness of the work. Some gambled, some sang. Most just stared into the flames, too tired for anything but silence. Every now and then a letter arrived from a family far away, reminding them that life continued elsewhere. Harvests planted, children born, wives waiting. But here life was reduced to earth and water. The canal crept forward, invisible to the rest of the world. The locks and the problem of gravity. One of the greatest challenges was not the digging itself, but the simple fact of geography. Water flows downhill, and New York was anything but flat. To overcome this, engineers designed a series of locks, stone chambers with wooden gates that could raise or lower boats as the elevation changed. Each lock had to be measured with precision. A single miscalculation could flood a section or strand boats in dry ground. The masons built them stone by stone, fitting each block by hand, the sound of chisels echoing through the forest. The gates were made of heavy oak sealed with pitch. It was painstaking work, but strangely elegant. A lock was not a machine, exactly. It was a controlled conversation between gravity and craftsmanship. When the first lock filled with water and worked as intended, the men cheered. It was a small triumph, swallowed quickly by the endlessness of what still lay ahead. The mules, when sections of the canal finally opened, they were not filled with ships or steamboats, but with slow, moving barges pulled by mules walking along a towpath. Each mule team worked long hours, guided by a boy or young man called a hoggy. The term came from the rough slang of canal life. No one quite remembered why. The mules were patient, deliberate animals, stepping carefully along the narrow paths. They were fed oats and hay, brushed at the end of the day, and rarely given rest. Their pace determined everything. A boat could move perhaps 4 miles an hour, faster than a man walking, slower than a horse on a road. Yet the canal made up for its slowness with reliability. It was smooth, predictable, and cheaper than any road. In a world that had always been limited by geography, the canal offered a new kind of certainty. The towns that followed where the canal passed, towns sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Places that had once been clusters of cabins, Syracuse, Rochester, Utica, began to grow into thriving centers of trade. Warehouses rose beside the water. Merchants built docks, mills, and taverns. Farmers sent their grain eastward. Merchants sent manufactured goods west. People followed the water's line, moving toward opportunity. Within a decade, land values along the canal soared. A journey from Buffalo to Albany, which had once taken weeks by wagon, could now be made in less than 10 days, and the cost of shipping goods dropped by nearly 90%. The canal had made movement, slow, steady, uneventful movement, the new engine of prosperity, the boredom of success. As the years passed, the canal became not a marvel but a habit. The slow creak of barges, the splash of mule hooves, the cries of boatmen, all became the background hum of daily life. Families lived on canal boats, children growing up among ropes, water barrels and lock gates. The rhythm of the locks marked their days like church bells. The canal had become not just a route, but a way of life. Quiet, repetitive, deeply ordinary. But that ordinariness was its triumph, because while great inventions often roar into history, the Erie Canal seeped into it, one slow, muddy, deliberate mile at a time. It turned the flow of commerce into something calm, predictable, and dull, and in doing so changed the world. The year is now 1825. After 8 long years, the Erie Canal is complete. Governor Clinton himself will soon ride a ceremonial barge from Buffalo to New York City, pouring water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic in what he calls the wedding of the waters. But for the men who dug it, the ceremony means little. The pay is gone, the camps dismantled, they scatter across the country, to new jobs, new canals, new anonymous labor. They will not be remembered, the ditch will, and as the first barge glides smoothly through the still water, you might wonder, was it worth it? All those years, all that earth, for a canal so quiet it barely seems alive. The year is 1825 and the water is still new. The Erie Canal has officially opened. A silver ribbon stretched across the state of New York, connecting 2 worlds. From Buffalo to Albany, the surface gleams in the autumn sun. Flags flutter from warehouses, bands play along the shore, and barges carry politicians, merchants, and curious families who want to see what has been made of the wilderness. Governor DeWitt Clinton stands aboard a ceremonial boat called the Seneca Chief, dressed in fine coat and hat, surrounded by applause. At the edge of Lake Erie, he pours a keg of water from the lake into the canal, a symbolic wedding of the waters, uniting the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. The crowd cheers. Cannons fire. Newspapers call it triumph of human enterprise. But beyond the celebrations, away from the music and speeches, the canal has already begun its second life. The quiet, endless work of carrying things from one place to another. The slow revolution. A canal is not like a road or a railroad. It has no sudden rush of speed, no noise of engines. Its power lies in its smoothness. In the years after its opening, the Erie Canal becomes a living artery of trade. Barges carry flour, lumber, coal, whiskey, and salt. Eastbound, they carry grain from the fertile lands of the Midwest. Westbound, they carry manufactured goods, tools, and books. Each barge is long and narrow, about 60 to 80 feet in length. It glides at a walking pace, pulled by a pair of mules along the towpath. The mule drivers, often young boys, walk beside them for miles, day after day, rain or shine. The canal freezes in winter, so its life is seasonal. In the spring thaw, boats rush to make up for lost time, their hulls scraping gently against the thawing ice. In summer, the air grows heavy with the smell of wet vegetation and mule sweat. In autumn, fog gathers low on the water in the early morning, hiding everything but the sound of hooves and splashing ropes. The rhythm of canal life becomes as predictable as the ticking of a clock, and for a young nation still unsure of its future, that predictability feels like progress. The floating homes, not everyone who traveled the canal did so for business. Many lived upon it. Entire families made their homes on the barges, following the slow route from town to town. A typical family might own a single freight boat, a long, low craft with a small cabin at the rear. Inside there would be a narrow bunk, a stove, and a cupboard nailed to the wall to keep dishes from sliding. Children learned to walk on swaying planks, to tie lines, to steer with the tiller. They played along the towpath, waving at other boats as they passed. Their lives were a mixture of monotony and adventure. The same stretch of water, again and again, and yet always a little different. As towns grew and new bridges rose over the canal, at night the boats tied up along the banks. Lanterns flickered across the water. Somewhere a fiddle played a slow tune. The canal at night was quiet, so quiet you could hear the soft breathing of the mules. The families called themselves cannelers. Others sometimes called them boat rats, but they knew the rhythm of the locks better than anyone. To them, the Erie Canal was not a marvel or an enterprise, it was simply home. The towns that grew like moss, the success of the canal reshaped New York. Albany, once a modest river port, became a bustling hub. Syracuse turned from a sleepy settlement into an industrial town famous for its salt works. Rochester and Utica expanded rapidly, their mills powered by the water that flowed beside them. Farmers who once struggled to sell their crops now found markets waiting. A barrel of wheat that had cost 100 to transport overland to the east coast could now be shipped for 10 by canal. Merchants, millers, blacksmiths, and innkeepers all prospered. Even the taverns along the towpath did well, serving cider, whiskey, and food to weary boatmen. These taverns became the unofficial heart of canal life, places of gossip, deals, songs, and fights. A traveller along the Erie Canal in the 1830s might see every kind of person: merchants with ledgers, immigrants seeking work, children tending mules, and women cooking meals aboard barges, all of them bound together by the same slow, steady current. The sound of work by day, the canal hummed with quiet motion. By night, it slept in a chorus of creaking timbers and rippling water. The locks were the busiest points. Each one was a kind of theatre. Boats entering, ropes thrown, gates opening with groaning hinges, water rushing in or out. Lock tenders managed the process, working from dawn to dusk. They lived in small cottages beside the locks, often with families of their own. The lock tender's life was both stationary and restless. He never moved, but the whole world passed by his door. He was, in many ways, the keeper of the canal's pulse. The opening and closing of a lock took only minutes, but multiplied by thousands of boats each season, it became the endless heartbeat of the canal, the slow, mechanical rhythm of America learning how to move. The human toll for all its success, the canal was not kind to its workers or travelers. Accidents were common. Mules slipped into the water and drowned. Boatmen fell from decks or were crushed between barges. Diseases, cholera, typhoid, malaria spread easily along the stagnant water. In 1832, a major cholera outbreak swept along the canal towns. Entire families vanished in weeks. The boats stopped running, and the water grew still. When the epidemic passed, the canal reopened as if nothing had happened. Commerce resumed. The rhythm of the locks began again. Progress, it seemed, could not afford to mourn. The competition arrives by the 1840s. The Erie Canal had already transformed the American economy. But even as it flourished, another sound began to echo in the distance: the whistle of the steam locomotive. Railroads were faster, stronger, and could run year-round. They did not freeze in winter or depend on mules. At first, canal men dismissed them. Too noisy, they said, too dangerous. But the trains kept coming, laying iron beside the water. For a time, the two worlds coexisted, steam and stillness. Barges continued to move their slow cargo while trains rushed past on parallel tracks. Travelers described the strange sight of a canal boat gliding peacefully along while a locomotive thundered beside it. The contrast was striking, the past and future of transport, side by side. The quiet endurance, despite the rise of railroads, the canal did not vanish. It adapted, widened, deepened, expanded. By mid-century, it had become not just a route for trade, but a symbol of persistence, proof that steady, methodical labor could still matter in a world growing ever faster. The canal became a teacher in patience. It reminded those who used it that time, like water, could be managed but never rushed. A farmer standing by the towpath could see his grain heading east, slowly, steadily, and know it would arrive. A child on a barge could fall asleep to the sound of the tow rope slapping gently against the water, dreaming of towns that waited along the way. The canal's greatness was not in speed or spectacle, but in the calm certainty of its function. The symbolic ditch by 1850, the Erie Canal was carrying more freight than all the railroads of the United States combined. But its success was quiet, almost invisible. It was, after all, just a long trench of muddy water, lined with stones and bordered by grass. Visitors expecting wonder often found only tedium. The boats moved too slowly to be exciting, the locks were repetitive, the scenery, fields, bridges, towns, blurred into sameness. Yet beneath that dullness lay something extraordinary, the first sustained experiment in industrial-scale human rhythm. The Erie Canal taught a nation how to measure progress not in bursts of invention, but in the steady accumulation of small, ordinary acts. Every shovel of dirt, every turn of a lock gate, every hoofprint along the towpath was part of a larger design, a design whose beauty was in its endurance. By now, the canal has been open for nearly 2 decades. The mules still walk, the barges still glide, and the locks still sigh open and closed like the lungs of a patient giant. The world beyond is changing, faster, noisier, hungrier for speed. But here, along this long, narrow waterway, time still moves as it always has, measured, deliberate, and faintly monotonous. The canal does not fight progress, it endures beside it. And yet, a question lingers in the still air over the water. How long can something built on patience survive in a world that is learning to rush? It is the late 19th century now. The canal that once glittered as a ribbon of promise across New York has grown older, and perhaps a little tired. The mules still walk, yes. Their bells still jingle faintly in the morning fog. The locks still creak open with the same patience. But there is a sense of something fading in the air, like the last echo of a song that once filled the world. The Erie Canal, once hailed as the eighth wonder of the world, has become simply the ditch. A necessary, useful, ordinary thing, and perhaps that is the truest measure of its success. The long shadow of steam. By the 1860s, railroads crisscrossed the state like veins of iron. Trains no longer ran beside the canal, they ran beyond it, reaching inland towns the canal never could. Freight that once floated east on slow barges now clattered by in freight cars. The sound of hooves and water was replaced by the metallic rhythm of pistons and wheels. But the canal still had its loyalists. Grain, coal, and lumber continued to move along its waters, slower, yes, but cheaper. For bulky cargo, time mattered less than cost. The railroads, for all their glamour, could not compete with the canal's quiet efficiency. So, through the middle of the century, the Erie Canal remained alive, not glorious, but essential, a dependable workhorse of trade. It was no longer a symbol of innovation. It was simply part of the landscape. The second generation, the children of the canal builders, were now old men. The young mule drivers of 1825 had become weathered captains, their faces lined by sun and wind. Their children, the second generation of canalers, were less certain of their future. Life on the canal was still hard. The hours were long, the pay low, and the accommodations cramped. For many families, the boat was still home, a narrow, floating cabin with a tiny stove, a rope bed, and a few keepsakes nailed to the walls. Children still learned to walk on decks that rocked gently beneath their feet. They learned to read from weathered books, if they learned at all. Their world was defined by water, rope, and the sound of wooden gates closing behind them. But beyond the towpath, the world had changed. Cities were rising, factories smoked, steamships crossed oceans. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than any boat could move. For those born on the canal, the future looked like a moving train, fast, unstoppable, leaving little room for those who lived at walking speed. The mule paths and machine tracks the canal authorities tried to adapt. In the 1860s and 1870s, the state launched major expansions, widening the canal, deepening it, improving its locks. The goal was to modernize it for larger boats and heavier cargo. New hydraulic lock gates replaced some of the old wooden ones. Stonework was repaired, towpaths graded, aqueducts reinforced. But there was no escaping the reality that the canal's rhythm was out of step with its age. It was built for an era when the human pace was the measure of the world, when a day's work could be measured by the length of a mule's walk. Now time was measured in miles per hour. The canal remained precise, predictable, and steady, but it was no longer enough. A society beside the water still, the canal continued to shape the towns that clung to its banks. Lockport, Fairport, Rome, and Canastota, places that might otherwise have been forgotten, became small centers of commerce. Warehouses lined the water's edge, their bricks darkened by decades of smoke and steam. Taverns stayed open late, filled with boatmen who argued about weather, wages, and politics. And along the towpaths, a peculiar culture of independence persisted. Canal workers, the canalers, were known for their stubborn pride. They worked when they wished, took contracts as they pleased, and cared little for the opinions of city folk. Their language was rough, their humor coarse, their loyalty absolute. To each other and to the water. To outsiders, they seemed backward. To themselves, they were free. That freedom would be difficult to surrender when the world around them began to change beyond recognition. The decline begins quietly. There is no single moment when the canal dies. No announcement, no closure. Its decline is slow, like water seeping into soil. The railroads take more freight each year. The towpaths grow quieter. Mules are fewer. Locks that once operated all day now open only occasionally. Some boats are left tied to the bank, slowly sinking into the mud. And yet, the canal does not vanish. It simply shifts into a different kind of usefulness. A lifeline for local trade, a relic that refuses to surrender. By the 1880s, tourists begin to travel the canal not for commerce but for curiosity. They come to see what their grandparents built, to drift along the same waters that once changed a nation. What was once the cutting edge of progress has become, in a single lifetime, a museum in motion. The modernization dream in the 1890s, engineers and politicians once again turned their attention to the canal. Could it be reborn? Could the symbol of an older America be remade for the modern age? In 1903, the state launched the Barge Canal Project, a massive reconstruction effort to widen and deepen the old Erie Road. allowing steel-hulled motor barges to replace wooden boats and mules. It was, in essence, an attempt to make the old canal new again, to preserve its role in commerce by dragging it reluctantly into the 20th century. But by then, the rhythm of life had already changed beyond recognition. Automobiles were appearing on city streets. Airplanes would soon follow. The canal's slow, liquid movement seemed like a memory of another kind of world. A world where time could still be touched and measured in ripples. The last of the canalers in the early years of the 20th century, a few old canalers still worked their rotes. They spoke of the old days, of frozen winters and spring floods, of the time Governor Clinton married the waters, of mules that knew their paths better than their drivers. They remembered when the canal was crowded with traffic, when one could walk the towpath for miles and never lose sight of another boat. By now, their stories were the last living link to a vanished America. To hear them speak was to listen to a language of patience, a way of life built on repetition and endurance. Their children did not return to the water. They became factory workers, railway men, or shop clerks. The age of mules and locks was ending quietly, not with a crash but with a sigh. The canal at rest by the mid-20th century, the Erie Canal had completed its long journey from wonder to workhorse to relic. The water still flowed, but more for recreation than for trade. Pleasure boats replaced freight barges, the towpaths became walking trails, and yet the canal never truly disappeared. It simply changed its purpose, just as the land around it had done 100 years before. It became a line of memory across New York, a reminder of a time when progress moved at the pace of footsteps and mule hooves, and when the measure of success was not speed but persistence. If you visit it today, you can still trace the old path. You can walk beside the water, listen to the hum of insects, and imagine the sound of hooves long gone. The locks still stand, their stone walls cool and damp. The air still smells faintly of earth and old timber. And if you stand there at dusk, when the wind is low, you might almost hear it again. The faint clink of a tow chain, the creak of a wooden gate, the ghostly murmur of a canal that once connected a young nation to itself. Reflections in still water, the Erie Canal's true legacy was not in the goods it carried or the towns it built. It was in the rhythm it taught. The rhythm of sustained effort, of quiet endurance, of lives lived in long, patient arcs. It was proof that the grandest transformations can come from the simplest motions, shovel by shovel, lock by lock, mile by mile. Even now, when the world moves faster than the builders of 1817 could have imagined, the canal remains a counterpoint, a slow, steady whisper reminding us that progress does not always require haste. Sometimes it only requires persistence. And so, in the silence of the old ditch, one can still feel the pulse of a country learning how to move, not through noise and speed, but through the quiet certainty of human labor. The water still flows, the stones still hold, the canal still endures, as all patient things do. But one might wonder, standing beside it today in our own restless age, could we still build something so deliberate, so slow, and yet so lasting? It is the middle of the 17th century, and the Dutch Republic is the busiest place on earth. While most of Europe still wakes slowly from the long chill of the Middle Ages, the Netherlands hums like a machine, measured, methodical, endlessly occupied. Its people are not warriors or kings. They are merchants, shipwrights, painters, and accountants. And yet, in their own quiet way, they have conquered the world. At the height of what would later be called the Dutch Golden Age, this small patch of land, carved stubbornly from the sea, commands a global empire. Ships from Amsterdam sail to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Money flows homeward like the tide. But what did it actually feel like to live here, in a land built on trade, thrift, and tides? If you were an ordinary Dutchman of the 17th century, what did you do all day? A morning beneath the bells, you wake not to sunlight, but to bells. In Amsterdam, the day begins early. The church towers ring at dawn, calling the faithful to prayer and the merchants to their ledgers. The air smells faintly of damp wood and coal smoke. If you are a craftsman, you might live above your workshop, a narrow, tall house with steep stairs and large front windows. The ground floor is your livelihood, a carpenter's bench, a painter's studio, or a small shop selling goods from overseas. Your wife and children stir upstairs. The youngest helps light the fire, the eldest sweeps the stoop. The Dutch pride themselves on cleanliness. A clean doorway is a mark of respectability, as much a moral duty as a practical one. Outside, the canal is already stirring. Boats deliver milk, bread, and peat for burning. Women lean from windows to shake rugs. A fishmonger calls out his morning catch. The city wakes not in bursts but in waves, steady, purposeful, almost mechanical. The merchants march at mid-morning, the merchants emerge. They wear dark coats of wool, wide collars of starched linen, and hats shaped like upturned bowls. Their steps are brisk, their expressions serious. They head toward the Beurs van Hendrik de Keyser, the Great Exchange. Beneath its vaulted roof, hundreds of men gather to trade ships, spices, and speculation. There are no shouting brokers here, only a steady murmur of calculation. This is the true heart of the Dutch Republic, not the church, not the palace, but the marketplace. A merchant might begin his day by checking the latest ship arrivals. News from Batavia, Curaçao, or the Baltic determines the mood of the room. Prices shift with the tides. A single rumour of storm, of war, of spoiled cargo can ripple across the city. The Dutch East India Company's VOC keeps records so detailed they could fill libraries. Every crate of nutmeg, every barrel of sugar, every spool of silk is logged, weighed, and valued. It is a world of numbers, and of faith in those numbers. To the merchants, profit is not greed. It is proof of divine order. The rhythm of labour while the merchants trade, the city labours. The shipyards of the Zandstreek thunder with hammers and saws. Here, hundreds of men work in the smell of pitch and pine, building vessels that will carry Dutch ambition to every horizon. Each ship is built like clockwork, the process so standardized that the Dutch can construct a warship in weeks rather than months. Carpenters plane timbers, blacksmiths forge nails, sailmakers stitch canvas in great airy lofts. The sound of work is constant, the rasp of saws, the thud of mallets, the shouts of foremen. Nearby, in warehouses that stretch for blocks, dock workers unload spices, tea, coffee, and porcelain. The air is thick with scent, sweet, sharp, foreign. For most of these labourers, the day begins at dawn and ends at sunset. Wages are modest but steady. They eat rye bread and cheese for breakfast, salted herring for lunch, and pea soup thick with bits of pork for supper. Their pleasures are simple: a pipe of tobacco, a mug of beer, a walk beside the canal. They do not think of empire or glory, they think of keeping dry feet, full stomachs, and steady work. The domestic empire inside the tall houses along the canals. Another kind of labour rules. Domestic labour. The Dutch home of the 17th century is both a refuge and a stage. Its polished floors, shining brass, and immaculate curtains reflect a culture obsessed with order. Women rise early to scrub, polish, and sweep. Linen is washed, bread baked, children dressed. Everything must appear tidy, for in a Dutch city, windows are large and curtains often open. The house is a statement of virtue. To modern eyes, this obsession might seem excessive, but for the Dutch, cleanliness was not vanity. It was a form of discipline. In a land reclaimed from the sea, where dikes and pumps must be maintained daily to keep the water out, disorder is dangerous. Cleanliness, thrift, and punctuality were not merely social virtues, they were survival strategies. It was said that a Dutchman could be recognized anywhere in the world by his neatness. Even at sea, sailors scrubbed decks until they gleamed. The nation's greatest painters, Vermeer, De Hooch, and Ter Borch, captured this domestic order in luminous detail: sunlight on tile floors, a woman reading a letter, a broom leaning in a doorway. These scenes were not fantasy, they were ideals, moral reminders that the health of a household reflected the health of the Republic itself. The golden afternoon, by midday, the hum of work has reached its peak. The canals are crowded with barges bearing goods from the countryside, butter, cheese, grain, and livestock. Farmers in flat, bottom boats steer slowly past warehouses stacked with sugar and tobacco. The air is filled with a mixture of smells: salt, tar, manure, and baking bread. Children run errands, apprentices carry ledgers, clerks hurry between counting houses, and always there are the bells, marking the hours, reminding everyone that time, too, must be managed. Lunch is simple but filling: dark bread, cheese, and beer. Tea and coffee are still luxuries for most, though they are beginning to appear in the homes of the prosperous. In wealthier households, a small porcelain cup of coffee is served with ceremony, the beans having travelled half the world from Java. Every sip, though ordinary now, is a triumph of global trade. The evening calm as the sun lowers over the western canals, the city softens. Shops close, the shipyards quiet, a faint mist gathers over the water. Families eat together, often in silence, the day's labour leaving little energy for talk. After supper, some read by candlelight. Others gather at taverns to drink and sing. Dutch beer is famous throughout Europe, clear, steady, and strong. It is the comfort of the working man, as much a part of life as bread or sleep. The more educated citizens visit coffee houses, where maps, newspapers, and ideas circulate as freely as smoke. Philosophers debate theology and trade routes with equal seriousness. In these dim, smoky rooms, one might overhear discussions of Spinoza's heretical ideas or the latest report from the East Indies. But for most, the evening ends early. The city sleeps before midnight, lulled by the slow slap of water against the stones. And yet, even in the quiet, someone is always awake, tending a watch, stoking a kiln, or writing a ledger by candlelight. The Dutch do not truly sleep. The work continues somewhere always. The invisible empire from the outside, the Netherlands of the 17th century, looks modest. No grand palaces, no glittering courts. Yet beneath this calm surface flows a vast, invisible empire of trade. Sugar from Suriname sweetens Amsterdam tea. Spices from the Banda Islands fill Dutch kitchens with scents of distant rainforests. Porcelain from China decorates the homes of merchants who have never seen the East. The wealth of half the world moves quietly through Dutch hands, counted, weighed, and taxed with remarkable precision. But all this wealth brings new questions. What does it mean for a people so devoted to modesty and discipline to command such riches? How long can a nation balance thrift and empire, piety and profit, before the scales tip? The bells will ring again tomorrow. The same merchants will walk the same streets. The same ships will sail outward, and others return heavy with goods. The city will wake, work, and sleep again, its rhythm steady, unbroken, relentless. It is a rhythm that built a nation and, for a time, shaped the world. But beneath the polish and the precision, the Dutch Republic is already straining under its own success. How long can a people who value modesty rule a world built on luxury? The year is 1660. Amsterdam stands at the center of the world's trade. A quiet, deliberate empire built not on conquest, but on calculation. From the North Sea to the South China Sea, ships fly the flag of the 7 provinces, orange, white, and blue. Their holds are filled with goods that once seemed the stuff of myth: pepper, nutmeg, cloves, porcelain, indigo, silk, and sugar. Every coin that clinks into a Dutch coffer has passed through storms, jungles, deserts, and wars. But in the counting houses along the Herengracht, it is all reduced to tidy columns of figures. The Dutch do not boast, they balance. Yet wealth brings not only comfort, but confusion, and the sense that the world, once so orderly, is growing harder to measure. The house that trade built, the richest men in Amsterdam, live along the Grachtengordel, the ring of canals that form the elegant heart of the city. Their houses are tall, narrow, and austere. The facades are brick, the windows large, the interiors sparse by modern standards. But everything gleams with restraint. You will not find gilded ceilings or velvet drapes here. Instead, there is polished oak, Delft tiles, silver candlesticks, and paintings. Many paintings. A wealthy merchant might own works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, or Frans Hals, but they hang not as decoration, but as documentation. Each canvas is a record of virtue, a mother reading scripture, a merchant with his ledgers, a still life of fruit beginning to decay, a quiet reminder that all wealth fades. Even in luxury, there is a sense of warning. Calvinism, the dominant faith of the Dutch Republic, preaches modesty and diligence. Pleasure is tolerated only if it serves discipline. A man may be rich, but he must never appear idle. The wind that powered the world. If you leave the city and travel north, the wind becomes stronger. It rushes across the flat fields, bending the reeds and turning the sails of hundreds of windmills. Each one groans softly as it works, sawing timber, grinding grain, pumping water, or pressing oil. The Dutch have mastered the wind as others have mastered steel or stone. They have built a nation that moves without horses or slaves, powered instead by air and ingenuity. Windmills keep the water at bay, reclaiming land from the sea. They turn lakes into fields and swamps into villages. Every acre of Dutch soil is a victory of engineering, a negotiation with the elements renewed every day. Children grow up with the sound of turning sails as others grow up with the sound of church bells. The wind is both enemy and ally, invisible, constant, and necessary. Without it, the land would drown. Without it, the ships would never sail. The ships that stitch the world together, at the ports of Hoorn and Enkhuizen, masts crowd the skyline. The great trading companies, the VOC Dutch East India Company and the WIC West India Company, send fleets across the globe. Each ship leaves carrying Dutch goods, wool, cheese, gin, and weapons, and returns with the luxuries of empire. But the voyages are long and brutal. Sailors face scurvy, mutiny, shipwreck, and tropical diseases. Many never return. Those who do are often silent about what they saw. Behind the polite arithmetic of profit lies the unseen machinery of suffering, enslaved labor in the Caribbean, monopolies enforced at gunpoint in the East Indies, and the quiet violence of commerce turned into conquest. Few Dutch citizens ever see these realities directly. They appear only as tidy entries in ledgers, 50 barrels sugar, 200 lebs indigo, 1 crate porcelain, and each number represents both triumph and tragedy, neatly balanced in ink. The accountants of empire, the Dutch, are meticulous record keepers. Every voyage is logged, every sail recorded. The archives of the VOC alone fill miles of shelves, millions of pages of contracts, inventories, and letters. A single merchant might spend more time writing than trading, filling his ledgers with tiny, perfect script. This precision is not merely habit, it is a national obsession. To the Dutch mind, order is not only moral, it is protective. A well-kept book guards against chaos, against both financial ruin and divine judgment. If the world is a storm, then a ledger is an anchor. And yet, as the numbers grow, as wealth expands beyond imagination, even the most careful minds begin to feel unease. Can order truly contain so much abundance? The illusion of infinite wealth. In 1637, Amsterdam experienced an event that seems almost absurd in hindsight, the tulip mania. For a brief, feverish period, the price of tulip bulbs, rare and colorful varieties imported from the East, rose to unimaginable heights. A single bulb could cost more than a house. Merchants, sailors, and servants alike joined the frenzy, buying and selling bulbs that sometimes existed only on paper. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The market collapsed, fortunes vanished overnight. In the city's coffeehouses, men sat in stunned silence, staring at contracts that were now worthless. The episode became a national embarrassment, a moral fable told for generations, a warning that even the most disciplined people can lose themselves to dreams of easy profit. But the truth was deeper and quieter. The Dutch did not stop trading tulips. They simply learned to treat speculation with more discretion. The mania did not destroy their wealth, it revealed its fragility. The world, it seemed, could be measured in numbers, but not always contained by them. The painters of precision, as the merchants counted their coins, the painters counted their brushstrokes. Dutch art of the Golden Age is unlike that of any other empire. There are no grand battle scenes or kings astride horses. Instead, there are kitchens, maps, and window light, a woman pouring milk, a man reading a letter, a maid sweeping a floor. These images, quiet as they are, reflect a profound truth about the Dutch spirit, that beauty lies in order and meaning in routine. A Vermeer painting might show only a few inches of sunlight falling across a tiled floor, but in that light, one feels the entire rhythm of Dutch life, deliberate, restrained, enduring. Even the still lifes tell stories: a cut lemon, a peeled orange, a dead bird, symbols of luxury and decay, of the transience of pleasure. In art, as in trade, the Dutch balanced abundance with warning. The fear beneath the fortune. By the 1670s, cracks begin to show in the polished facade of Dutch prosperity. England and France, jealous of the Republic's wealth, turn their navies against it. Wars strain the treasury and disrupt trade. The canals of Amsterdam remain calm, but the merchants grow cautious. Ships are lost. Insurance rates climb. The profits of peace give way to the costs of defense. At home, preachers warn that God frowns upon pride. Pamphlets circulate denouncing luxury, excess, and moral decay. The Dutch, who once saw wealth as proof of divine favor, now fear it as a temptation. The same order that once gave them strength begins to feel like a cage, too rigid to adapt to a changing world. Still, the bells ring each morning. The markets open. The windmills turn. The Republic endures not through conquest or faith, but through habit. The empire without a crown, the Dutch Republic, has no king, no empire of marble or gold. It is governed by merchants and regents, men of modest taste but immense influence. Their power lies not in spectacle but in systems, in taxes, treaties, and trade routes. It is an empire of paper, of contracts and cargo lists, of tides and ledgers. Even the Dutch Navy, among the strongest in the world, operates less for glory than for protection of commerce, to rule without ruling. This is the Dutch paradox. They control the flow of goods and money but claim no divine right to do so. They conquer without crowns. It is a new kind of power, modern before its time, and deeply unsettling to those who still believe that greatness must look grand. A restless peace. By the close of the century, the Dutch Republic remains prosperous, but wary. Its merchants are still rich, its cities still clean, its windmills still turning. But the energy that once propelled it has softened into routine. The nation that once defined progress now defines stability. From the outside, nothing seems amiss, but those who live within its narrow houses and along its damp streets feel something changing, an unease that prosperity cannot soothe. The world beyond grows larger, faster, more ambitious. England and France are building empires of their own, with armies and kings to match. And the Dutch, disciplined, deliberate, deeply practical, begin to wonder if the world will leave them behind. The bells still ring at dawn. The ledgers still balance, the ships still sail. But beneath the calm surface of the canals, the water moves restlessly. The Dutch Republic, so careful, so precise, so modest, stands at the edge of its own success, uncertain whether its order can withstand the chaos it helped create. How long can a nation built on restraint survive in a world that rewards ambition?